it's entirely appropriate that Gavin chairs this session because Gavin and Victoria's DPI have been excellent supporters of our modelling work. Okay. Well, should regional communities be afraid of buyback? According to Warren Truss, they should be because it would lead to a national tragedy. My proposition, which takes off from where John Freeman finished comments in the last session, is that the basin communities have faced hard times due to drought and more recently flood, and that buybacks are quite second order. Now, is there any way to demonstrate this? And I say yes, we can run both the drought and buybacks through a dynamic CGE model which has regional representation within the basin. First though, let's put the basin irrigation into perspective, because dryland production within the Murray-Darling Basin accounts for well over 60% of farm output. And for every hectare of irrigable land, there are 52 hectares of dryland agriculture. So it is quite relevant when you start, relevant modelling should include some sort of land water constraint that allows mobility of resources between irrigation and dryland activities. Now, we are able to show fairly easily from ABS statistics that water is mobile. And what I've got here is a comparison between the drought year of 2002-3. At that stage it was a drought of a century. We've had 2 or 3 since then. And compare that drought with 2001-2. Now I've put in these green colours here, whatever that colour is, the 2 sectors of interest. The first thing we show is that there's a lot of movement out of using water for irrigated pasture. And apparently perversely, there was an increase in use of water in cereals. Well, what possible explanation could there be for that? And a lot of it has to do with dairy. Dairy uses a lot of water in a normal year, but it's also quite possible for dairy production to move between irrigated and dryland production. So during a drought, when water becomes too scarce and too expensive, dairy producers may purchase fodder, which indeed may be grown in dryland. It's grown mainly in dryland production technologies. Now, I'm never confident about this slide, so I haven't really got enough of these to go around. But the idea of this is to show you that the idea is that the slide, one slide is meant to be yellow and one slide is meant to be green. This is Waikerie, which is a rather dry place in the Riverland. Waikerie consists of nothing but orchards, vineyards and some of the driest dryland farming in the world. Whereas Shepparton, which is meant to be green and doesn't look so here, I anticipated that because the only place it ever looks green is on my own PC. But on the printout you've been given, it sort of looks green with a bit of imagination. So what we're really saying is that Shepparton's a sort of place where there is a fair bit of resource mobility between dryland and irrigated agriculture. There's a lot of dairy there, which is the right sort of industry for that mobility. Of course, Shepparton also has a lot of apple orchards as well. But there's more mobility between irrigation and dryland here than there is in Waikerie. There's virtually none in Waikerie. And we can reflect that in the model in the database weights. As long as we have the theory set up to allow that mobility, we can cater for both a high degree of mobility and a low degree of mobility between dryland and irrigation technologies. Now let's turn to the drought. Well, a really good estimate of the inflows into the Murray Basin in this 3-year drought, which was the lowest rainfall on record in the heart of the catchment, is 0. Right? 0 runoff in the 3 years from 2006 to 2008. The driest rainfall event on record. Okay, so that is where the crisis began. Now, the first thing we're going to do is use some very simple estimates just to work out how drought compares with buyback. So, drought knocks dryland productivity, it knocks the rain that falls on irrigation land. Remember that for each 100 millimetres of rainfall you have 1 megalitre per hectare of water, so the more rain you have, the less you need to irrigate. So rainfall and water go together on irrigable land. So in a drought, you knock out dryland productivity, you knock out both the rainfall and water allocations in the irrigated areas, and there's no compensation. With buyback, you farmers sell some of the water to the government, and they're fully compensated. So just looking at that, we can get some sort of idea of how buybacks compare with drought. And just to make sure that Neil's awake, this is a Productivity Commission number. 796 gigalitres of water was already sold by the 31st of January last year. It's now up to about 1,000, I believe. Okay, and then let's put some numbers on that. According to my estimates, dryland productivity accounts for about 6.8% of GDP in the basin, and irrigation activity accounts for about 6.1%. So my guess is that when we multiply those together, we knock GDP by 6.7% in the basin due to drought. Now that's a bit of a naive estimate because we've got resource mobility, which I mentioned, which allows water to move between different uses and to move out of uses such as pasture and rice in the dry times. So this is an overestimate, and likewise, because of resource mobility, and this is an even bigger overestimate of what buyback does to GDP in the basin. This is greatly exaggerated, but that's a reasonable first guess. Okay, let's turn to the drought and see how that first guess compares with the model real GDP. Well, the big difference. Why does dryland fall by a smaller amount? It's because we have a land water constraint, and some of the land has moved into, some of the irrigable land has moved to dry land as we've run out of water. So that's a slightly smaller loss than we had from our first guess. What about the irrigated activity? Well, water trading and resource movements mean that we get a substantial reduction in the income losses on in irrigated output than we had from our first guess, and then the downstream processes make up for some of that. So we end up with a 5.7% income loss due to drought compared with 6.7% from our first guess. Now, how did our modelling go? Well, we can't compare like with like, but we can compare our drought simulation with a 2007-8 base, and we can compare observed 2007 with 2005-6. So it's not quite like with like, but it will give us some idea of whether our modelling is on track. Well, looking at the first, and again we can only concentrate on the first two at the time available, cereal and dairy cattle. Whoops. And the funny thing is that we seem to have done better. Now, I wish that Mr. Gregson were in the room at the moment. He could explain to us why output of dairy cattle has actually gone up in the ABS data when the water used in dairy cattle production has gone down by 65%. Right? This is taken from ABS data. And similarly for cereals, we've had output go up when water use has gone down. Well, the answer is that there's been resource movements beyond what we modelled. In the modelling, we thought that there'd be a reduction in the amount of water used in cereal production and in dairy, but it turns out that there weren't even reductions, at least in terms of purely output. Bear in mind this is on a evaluated basis, and this is taken from raw data, which can only be on an output basis. So this is not a evaluated figure here. Okay, so right, and what we think happened is that there was a large biofuels-induced hike in the price of grains in 2007-8, which meant that that was something we didn't include in the modelling that might explain the difference between the observed and the modelled results. And also we have to be aware that dairy value added probably went down because farmers would have spent a fortune feeding their cows on fodder as long as the dairy prices were